and I'm sure there'll be others who will drift in as we get started, but we've got the equivalent of 4 weeks of work to kind of touch on, at least today, as we wrap up the semester. It's also, by this stage of the course, I'm also hoping, and I think with some confidence given the assignments I've just marked, hope you'll feel free to kind of use this as a day to pull stuff together. And that may mean interrupting and asking questions that kind of say, but over in that corner of Old Testament introduction we've been saying or reading blah, how does that fit with what we're talking about in this section? So this is the last opportunity within this course in a face-to-face context to ask those sort of integrating questions. And for some of you, probably David, and I think for Alan and for Jeff, and probably for Nick, this is the end of the grad cert track. So unless we've sneakily infected you with the theological bug, no, and probably Bill as well, I suspect. This must be about your fourth subject as well, yeah. So a number of you, this is kind of the end of this particular journey in terms of doing the grad cert. So it'll be interesting during the day to just kind of reflect on how that has integrated with your professional role in the ministry of the church, in schools and other contexts like Anglicare, and so either in the class context or just personally or even afterwards with an email, it'd be good to sort of see how that's gone, because for some of us this has been at least a 2 to 2.5 year journey with the occasional semester off and things like that. So I'm glad you've got to this point, and I still live in that naive hope that the bug might just reassert itself and you just can't bear to leave. However, if you are exiting with the grad cert, don't forget what you need to do is there's a little form you download off the student admin site, and it's called Application to Exit with a Lesser Award, which is a classic bureaucratic title, like dummies line up here kind of thing. It's not meant to imply that. But because the grad cert is an exit award from the grad dip, if you want to not simply quit but exit with the grad cert, you have to apply for that. And there's no fee, it's automatically approved. They just want to know that is your intention. You want the grad cert, you're not simply stopping study, and then it's processed. And we'll drag you back to the cathedral in February so the Archbishop can shake your hand and all that sort of stuff. So if you get stuck with any of that process, just give me a yell. All right, so what we're going to be looking at today, we've got 4 sessions to work with. The first session we're going to focus a bit on basically the more sort of poetic literature of the Old Testament, and particularly focusing on the Psalms and the Megilloth, which are the 5 short poetical scrolls. And we'll begin by setting that a little bit in the context of the Kethubim, the writings. Okay, so we've got Torah, the law, we've got Nevi'im, the prophets, and then you've got Kethubim, which is just the Hebrew word for writings, or if you like, scriptures, because scriptures is just a fancy way of saying writings. Okay, so part of what we're doing today is to actually move into that other major section of the Jewish scriptures. And I'm certainly constantly caught in the sort of traffic lights, or the headlights, I guess the metaphor is, like a rabbit in the headlights, wanting to pay attention to the Jewish shape of these texts, hence Torah, Nevi'im, Kethubim, and understand them in that kind of context, but also reminding myself all the time that we're reading them and we're experiencing them as parts of the Christian Bible, where they're not organised that way, but it's law, history, poetry, major prophets, minor prophets. And major and minor there relates to length, not to significance. Okay? So we're sort of part of the course, and indeed part of today, is being aware of that dynamic where these texts which are part of the Christian Bible are also texts that are in the Jewish Bible, where they function and indeed are imagined differently. Okay, so we're playing with that sort of tension as we think about the Kethubim. And I don't have a resolution for that kind of dynamic, it's just a dynamic we're aware of. So we'll look at the Psalms and the Megilloth. After the break we'll look more at wisdom and apocalyptic. Then after lunch, I want to look more at, put all of that in the larger context of the Jewish writings from the Second Temple period, because if certainly in the case of the Old Testament Apocrypha, and indeed the Old Testament Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, we're dealing with not just the biblical texts, but with texts which continue to be generated and received and read and argued over through the life of the Second Temple period, down to at least the end of the first century, the Common Era. Okay, by which time the canonical boundary issues become a bit more problematic for both the Jewish community and the emerging Christian community. So understanding how we ended up with the Old Testament also involves recognizing that these were not the only books that Jewish people were reading and writing, in the first century BCE, and so we just got every book they wrote became biblical. No, it wasn't like that. They wrote lots and lots and lots of books, and a selection of them became canonical. So there's a relationship between the canonical set and the larger set, and we can only, in some sense, only understand the canonical set within the context of the larger set. So there's a dynamic between understanding the canonical text in the light of the larger set of literature, because sometimes there are allusions and other things, and of course it's also recognizing why certain ones were out and certain ones were in, what's going on there. And the early Christians equally were not only reading the books that ended up in the Old Testament, they were reading the kind of sacred writings which were around in the Jewish community. And so their idea, their sense of sacred writings or scripture was not as precise as the later Christian view of the Old Testament canon. So playing with that diversity around the amazing complex world of Jewish writings from the Second Temple period. Then we'll have a coffee break, and in the last hour I want us to focus on the more theological question, which is so how do we use these texts in our Christian theology? Okay, let's look at some of those issues. All right, so what I'm going to do for the first two sessions, rather than having a PowerPoint, which is a reflection of time pressures more than anything else, I'm going to use some material that's already on the website, and I'm just going to, and also means I can zoom it up and make it a bit bigger for you, which is not so easy to do, and there'll be PowerPoint type stuff in the final two sessions. So I'm going to the main Old Testament page for this subject. I'm going right down to today's seminar, okay, seminar 4, and I'm actually going to go in here to Psalms and Megilloth, okay, into that document, which you may not have had a chance to print off yet because it only became available a couple of hours ago. All right. So we're going to, as I said, we're going to be focusing really all the material until afternoon tea time will be relating to the Kethubim, and we'll start off by focusing on the more sort of poetic texts, looking at the book of Psalms and the scroll of the five, the Megilloth. And I know from having just finished reading a whole bunch of essays, there are a number of people in the room that are quite up to speed with the most recent literature, both on Psalms and poetical literature, but also wisdom literature, which we'll come to shortly. Okay, so I'm going to come in down here with the Kethubim. We'll see how I can zoom it up as I need to. Okay, so we're starting off there looking at the Kethubim. Now, as I'm sure you sort of know, somewhere in the back of your head, the acronym for the scriptures in the Jewish tradition is Tanakh. Okay, and it is an acronym, and it reflects the typical Hebrew characteristic of a 3-consonant, 3-letter root for most words. Okay, so the T, N, K are the key parts of that word, and the vowels are just there to kind of join the consonants, which is basically how Hebrew and related languages work. So Tanakh is an acronym that reflects Torah, Nevi'im, and of course Kethubim, and it's the Kethubim that we're focusing on today. Okay, so what we're dealing with is the dynamic that at some stage in the history of the canonical, what became the canonical texts, we not only have a veneration and if you like a reception of the Torah scrolls, okay, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that they not only take on a really significant role in the life of the Jewish community, along with a secondary body of text called generally the prophets. And then ultimately this larger body of literature splits into the prophets and the other writings. Now a bit later on today we'll see an actually early 2nd century BCE document, the prologue to the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, or sometimes called Ben Sirah. And this is a document written around about 180 BCE. It's in the Apocrypha, it's not in the first canon, if you like. So it's not in the Hebrew canon. And in there, in that prologue, which we'll come to later today, he actually reflects on this diversity of the sacred writings, the law, the prophets, and the other material which had been written. Whereas when we look at the early New Testament texts, or texts from the New Testament, which are early in Christianity, we typically find references to the law and the prophets. Okay, this happened to fulfill what was written in the law and the prophets. And so the Mount Transfiguration story is Moses and Elijah turn up, representing the law and the prophets, presumably, as well as other dynamics. In the case of Luke chapter 24, the Emmaus Road story, the Christ figure, the stranger who turns up with the 2 disciples as they're walking home, he unpacks and he draws out from the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Okay, and presumably what Luke is doing there is to allude to this category called Kethubim, of which the Psalms was the first, the largest, and the most theologically significant document. So we've got Ben Sirah, the prologue to Ben Sirah, just after the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, alluding to this law, prophets, and the other writings written by holy men amongst us. And then you get the New Testament Gospels, particularly going into Luke, Acts, not only referring to the law and the prophets, but also beginning to say the law, the prophets, and the other stuff, in this case the Psalms. Okay, so now what we don't know, that's a bit like a black box, and it's somewhere in the bottom of the Indian Ocean. Okay, we don't exactly know how that process happened. Okay, what appears to be fairly clear is that around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, in other words, in the early Persian period, when the Jewish community is kind of rebuilding itself, reconstituting itself, with and very much a case of reconstituting as in whether there was a document called a constitution, what are the ground rules for our life together? Okay? We're no longer going to be a kind of independent country with our own ruler and army, with aspirations of controlling our neighbours. Okay? We're now going to live in a world run by other people's empires, and that's where we've been pretty well ever since. Okay, so the dynamics become different. Now, in that context, Torah takes on a very significant role as the foundational stories for what we would call, say, Judaism. Now, that's not quite what they're calling themselves at the time, but in hindsight we'd say that's the beginnings of Judaism as distinct from the religion of ancient Israel, okay, which was a more diverse kind of thing. The prophetic texts are also beginning to come into play around that time, although their exact status is not clear to us. But they're obviously being collected and edited and preserved and transmitted, or else they would have disappeared. And there are also texts which ultimately will end up in the Kethubim, but which originally would have just been in this other group of prophetic writings, which, remember, for the Jewish tradition includes what we call as historical books. Okay, so again, we've got the terms are being used in ways that don't exactly fit with the way we would use them normally. Okay. So when they talk about law or Torah, they're not just talking about a list of rules. It's not a compliance process. It's a covenant document which tells the story of how the people came to be in this relationship with God, and what God expects of them and what they can expect of God. And that's Torah. It's not just 631 rules and don't miss one of them. Okay? That's a Christian prejudice against Judaism. It's not actually how Torah functions within ancient or modern Judaism. Okay? That's not to say there aren't very religious Jews who would appear to outsiders to be OCD when it comes to observing all the regulations and the rules, and not just of the Torah, but of the Mishnah and the Talmud as well, just as there are Christians like that and Muslims like that. That's a possibility of human religiosity, okay? But it's not innate to Judaism that it's legalistic or pharisaical. Okay? They're polemical terms Christians have historically used to differentiate Judaism from the religion of grace, okay, which incarcerates people, chops off their heads, burns them at the stake, and invades the Middle East in the Crusades. But we're not violent like the God of the Old Testament. Okay, so you see how we sort of position ourselves against the other, and the other is always not quite as good as we are. Otherwise we'd swap. And that's just how humans do stuff, I guess. So this process of the emerging scriptures means that somewhere in what we typically call the post-exilic period, but somewhere in the period during the Persian Empire and the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander the Great, and prior to the advent of Rome, direct Roman rule, so basically the last 400 years before the Common Era, that's the window, or that's the black box. Okay, we can sort of see what's going into it historically and in terms of literature. What comes out the other end is basically the Tanakh. Okay, in both its Jewish or Hebrew and Greek versions. Okay, what becomes the Masoretic text and what becomes the Septuagint. Okay, and because there's 1,000 PhDs in trying to understand what's happening inside the box. But it's both the Persian period and the very early Hellenistic period. So basically the 400s and the 300s are going to be absolutely critical to the story of how we got the Bible. And the sad thing is we know not very much about those periods in terms of the texts. Because even the texts that were written in that period tend to talk about the past rather than describing what's happening at the time of the writer. Okay, now a classic example of that, and it's not without some controversy for people, but in terms of biblical scholarship it's a sort of a lay down misere, but a good example of that would be the book of Daniel, which sounds like it's from the Babylonian period. Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, all that sort of stuff. It's almost certainly from the time of the Maccabean revolt, around about 167. How was that roundabout, and give you an exact year, but in that sort of period. Okay, and it's talking about the present by using categories and characters and dynamics from the past. Okay. Now, of course, there are people who will argue for a 5th century date for Daniel, but the majority of biblical scholars would see Daniel as coming from the Hellenistic period in the Seleucid time, and indeed just at the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. So that's very close to Jesus. That's only 150 years or so before the birth of Jesus. Okay. So it's not surprising then that the book of Daniel is not amongst the prophetic literature in the Hebrew canon, although it is one of the prophetic texts in the Greek canon. Okay, because it sort of came on the scene too late to be a part of the book of the 12. Because if we had to choose, I suspect if we were a committee of Jewish rabbis, meeting in the 3rd century, and one of the items on the agenda was to finalize the composition of the scroll of the 12, and we had a choice of putting in Jonah or Daniel, we'd probably put Daniel in. Okay, Jonah has all sorts of challenges for readers, including the fact that there's not much content in it. Okay, and also it's actually kind of In a sense, it celebrates God's compassion for non-Jews. So it's not going to be core reading in that sense. And yet, Jonah gets into the book of the 12, and Daniel is relegated or takes its place, okay, amongst the Kethubim. Now we don't know, so we can be sure that Daniel, like Jonah, comes out of this period, somewhere in the Persian, mid to late Persian period, through to the early Hellenistic or the high Hellenistic period. The question then is, people will locate the text in slightly different positions, but the if you like, the big story is the Bible we have is the Bible that was finalized between the 5th century and the 2nd century BCE. And the people that were doing that were people based in and around Jerusalem. They were not from Samaria. They were not from the north. They were not from Galilee. They were not from Babylon. They were not from Alexandria, where there were large Jewish diaspora communities. So the Bible, the Tanakh, is a Jerusalem project, coming out of the dynamics of the Persian and, if you like, early Hellenistic period, like 100 to 150 years after Alexander the Great. Okay, that's not a question. That's just a playing with a pen. Yep, that's all right. I thought you were putting your hand up. So that's the big kind of framing thing as we try to understand the Kethubim. We don't know the exact processes. For instance, we can't be sure whether the Torah texts were finalized before the prophetic texts, but and the other wild card in this, of course, is that Torah is also sacred to the Samaritan community, but only Torah. Okay, not the prophetic texts, however defined. The Samaritans only have the Pentateuch. Yeah.
Do we have transcripts that, was their Torah the same as the Hebrew, the ones we accept?
Sure. The Samaritan Pentateuch is certainly very ancient, and it largely coincides with the Hebrew Pentateuch. Who's in the last year? The group that was with me, we actually went to Nablus, which is the centre for the existing Samaritan community. There are still Samaritans. I mean, there are about 700 of them left in Israel that identify as Samaritans. Okay, and so they have an interesting relationship with the state of Israel. Okay, they're Arabs, they're Samaritans, and they're Torah observant, but not the Jewish Torah, the Samaritan Torah. And they still sacrifice animals, okay, which the Jews are not doing because the Muslims have got the Temple Mount. So it's very dynamic. So we met the sort of senior leader of the Samaritan community, and he talked about Pentateuch and so on. Now, yes, there are differences. Some of the differences are no more significant than the differences we get between Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus and Codex Vaticanus, all of which are copies of the Greek Bible, and there are textual variants. Some of them are deliberate changes to focus on Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem as the place where God wants to be worshipped. And of course they're saying the Jews changed the text, and the Jews are saying the Samaritans changed the text, and the Muslims saying you both got it wrong. The promise is to Ishmael, not to Isaac. Okay, so Muslims, Jews, Samaritans are all claiming to be the descendants of Abraham and the people of the covenant. Okay, and the real difference, if you like, between a Muslim, a Samaritan, and a Jew is not their ethnicity, but their religious identity. Okay, these are really the same people. If we look at it in ethnic terms, they're the same people. Now, sure, some of the Jews have had 1,000 years or so in Europe, and the Samaritans have had 1,200 years of living under Muslim rule and so on. So you get all kinds of other issues. But we're not talking about totally different ethnicities. We're talking about the same Semitic group of people who have the same story but tell it differently and position themselves against each other. And so Scripture becomes very much the tool in that process. And I guess what I'm entertaining as a possibility, that back in the 4th and 3rd century, much the same kind of dynamic was happening. What the outsider would have called the Jewish community in Samaria or Nablus or Shechem was positioning itself, and they had their traditions. Shouldn't call them a variant. They had their traditions, and they're the traditions of northern Israel, the northern kingdom. In Jerusalem, there's another group of people also identifying as Jewish, worshipping Yahweh, and they have many of the same traditions, and they're organising themselves differently. Now, by round about the year 100, the power dynamics are such that the Hasmonean rulers in Jerusalem capture and burn down the Samaritan temple on Mount Shechem. Okay, so like we won. Okay, but the Samaritans continued to be there, as we know from the New Testament. The Samaritan community did not disappear, and indeed there's just a tiny community, and they have all sorts of issues because of inbreeding and so on. I mean, they haven't married outside their community enough to maintain good genetic health and that sort of thing. So there's all sorts of major issues. And you think we have trouble retaining young people in an Anglican church? Try growing up as a young Samaritan in Israel who wants to go to university. Okay, the peer pressure to assimilate is enormous. But in its own way, that's what's happening in the Persian and Hellenistic period. If you weren't going to be a peasant chipping away at your veggies or following your goats around the hill country of Judea, if you wanted to move up in the world in some way, if you had that opportunity, then the ticket you paid was assimilation. Okay? That was the price of becoming a Hellenistic man. Women need not apply, really. That was a deliberate gender statement. Okay? So the dynamics that we might observe today about, for instance, Christian Arabs, should they join with the IDF? Should they volunteer to serve in the Israeli army? Okay, as Christian Arabs with Israeli citizenship, do they serve in the Israeli army and man the checkpoints on the West Bank? Okay, controlling the Arabs, the West Bankers. Okay, if you're a Samaritan and you want to go to university, you want to get into a real job, have a career, raise your family, move out of the little tiny inbred Samaritan community. If you're a gypsy in parts of Europe, or if you're a Jewish person in the 2nd or 3rd century, how do you move outside a very constricted role? And what's the function of the sacred stories of the scriptures in shaping those possibilities? So assimilation and resistance become one of the dynamics of this period, and in some sense the Jewish scriptures are the product of that dynamic between assimilation and resistance. How much do we buy into the Persian world? How much do we buy into the Greek world? How much do we resist? Right? The Septuagint, translating the Jewish scriptures into Greek, is a significant act of assimilation. The Maccabean rebellion is a significant act of resistance. Okay? And yet the book of Daniel, which probably comes out of the Maccabean crisis, imagines Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, the famous 3 guys in the furnace, they are being groomed for roles in the bureaucracy of the Persian Empire as young Jewish scholars. So the possibility of a brilliant career in the Persian imperial administration was there, at least in the imagination of the person who writes the book of Daniel. Okay? So all these dynamics going on, and of course all we can do is sort of poke at it. We can't really get a grip on what's going on. But it does remind us that this thing didn't just drop out of heaven bound in black leather and with gold trim on the side of the page. Okay, it's a very complex process.
So is this sacred book or not?
Sorry?
Is this sacred book or not?
It's a sacred book because people treat it as a sacred text. It shapes people's religion. It shapes people's lives. Do you mean, is it written by God? That's a different word than sacred. A sacred book. I mean, Hindus have sacred books. Muslims have sacred books. It's a piece of human literature, but the subject matter is the covenant with Yahweh. Okay, and that's a sacred text. God doesn't write it. God doesn't write it.
Sacred, holy.
Sacred or holy, I think, are synonyms in this case. But the other issue is how do we think about and articulate God's role in the creation of the Bible versus humans' role in the creation of the Bible. Okay, and God doesn't actually hold a pen in his hand and write. So human literature is
How
composed.
do you know this?
Well, I'm not going to argue that point. I think that's like saying there are no fairies in pink tutus out behind the chapel. I can't prove they're not there, and if you think you see them there, fine. But I think that's what I'm saying. I think it's the same category of information. Human literature is explainable 100% by human cause. We can explain everything about the Bible in terms of how it got created in totally natural, humanistic explanations. Now, that doesn't mean we don't also give it theological and revelatory significance. But how the book came to be generated, that's a historical question. That's a human question. So the big issues here, there's the who gave us the Bible? Well, in a sense, people gave us the Bible. But we also want to say God gave us the Bible. But then we're using the word give not in a natural sense. Okay? And we play with this mystery all the time in church, and particularly a sacramental kind of mystery. We talk about, particularly with the Eucharist, okay? We talk, it's bread and wine. And yet we're also saying we're feeding on Christ. So it's this kind of double mystery. And so my way of approaching Scripture is a kind of quasi-sacrament. That just as the bread and wine are real bread and wine, and they have the sacramental value, the Bible is real human literature, but it is also, when we encounter it, and we'll talk about this in the latter part of the day, when we encounter Scripture in a community of faith and in an attitude of faith, it becomes an encounter with God. But it's still a human text. There are no other forms of text. Non-humans do not generate texts.
I'm not saying
Yep.
you do.
Yeah, so that's why I'm just responding to your question that
I try to make when we go.
yeah, well, wherever we're going, it seems to me it's important that we start with a recognition that the Scriptures are essentially human documents. Just like wherever we go with Jesus in terms of Christology, I believe we have to start with the point that Jesus is entirely and thoroughly human. Because if we start with Jesus, who's anything other than human, we're going to get a very distorted kind of Christology. And similarly with the Bible, my approach would be that we work with what I would call the realities, that the Bible is a human text, and then we talk about to what extent do we attribute divine significance, or sacred significance, probably not divine significance, to these texts. And it's a very important question, because it goes to the heart of how do we study these books and how do we understand them, how do we frame them. Yeah, so it's a big question. Okay, and we'll come back to it particularly in the final session when we talk about using the Bible in our theology. Okay, so the Kethubim themselves, so we're not exactly sure the precise historical processes which gave us the Kethubim, but we know it's the dynamics going on between assimilation and resistance through the Persian and the Hellenistic periods. And as the Jewish community goes through that process, they not only look to their ancient traditions, they also generate the texts which become the Bible, the Jewish Bible. Now, the works that now comprise the Kethubim, in other words, once the prophetic text, the secondary prophetic collection separates into a subset, so we end up with the prophetic scrolls in another section, and we get these collection of texts that make up the Kethubim, okay? So we've got three really large scrolls that come at the front. This is in the Jewish ordering of the Hebrew canon, okay? The Psalms, Job, and Proverbs. And again, part of one of the realities of how ancient texts were organised, they tend to be organised by length. Okay? So when you get the letters of Paul, for instance, okay, they're separated from the Gospels because they're not the Jesus books, they're the letters of Paul. Okay? Whether Paul wrote them or not, here's a set of documents which say they're letters of Paul, so it makes a set. And then how are they arranged? Basically from Romans through to Philemon, they're arranged in descending order of length. Romans is listed first, not because it's most important, not because it was written first, not because R comes before whatever, okay, but because it's the longest. Then you get 1 Corinthians because it's the second longest. Then you get 2 Corinthians because it goes with 1 Corinthians but it's shorter. So 1st and 2nd Corinthians simply means long and short Corinthians, not 1st and 2nd. It's like major and minor prophets, okay? Interestingly, the so-called pastoral epistles lie outside that descending order. Okay, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus are not within the sequence. They're in their own little set of longest to shortest. And they're probably a secondary addition to the Pauline corpus. Okay? It's the same sequencing we find in the Quran. Each of the surahs, Surah 1 is the longest, and so on. Okay? And they just in descending order. That's an ancient method for organising material by size. Okay, we have slightly more sophisticated cataloguing systems these days, but that's a very ancient way of doing things. So not surprisingly, Psalms, Job and Proverbs take pride of place, and Psalms, of course, in particular. Then we have a collection of 5 little scrolls called the Megilloth, and these are the festival scrolls, so-called, Ruth, Canticles, Kohelet. Kohelet is also Ecclesiastes. Canticles is Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. Lamentations and Esther. And we'll come back and look at those in a little bit more detail. And then we have Daniel, which is kind of in a category of its own within this set. And of course in the Greek version of Daniel, Daniel is somewhat longer, as is Esther in the Greek version of the Bible. And then in the Jewish way of thinking about it, we have a book called Ezra Nehemiah, which in English Bibles is split into 2 different books. And then we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is sort of like 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. It's the one book, but it's so long it stretches over 2 scrolls. Again, the technical social information background there, of course, is that scrolls were of set lengths, standard lengths. And just as you can go into a stationary newsagent shop and you can get a 24-page exercise book or a 48-page exercise book or a 96-page exercise book for your child as they're starting school, so you could go to the market and you could buy a scroll of various lengths. But you couldn't have it any length. There were standard lengths. Okay? So things would go over onto a second scroll. And then, of course, you have to fill the scroll because it's so expensive. You're not going to leave the back half empty. So
how expensive?
Well,
in terms of cows, for example.
I don't know it in terms of cows. Cows were not a particularly big product in the Mediterranean world, but in terms of the New Testament documents, so in the Hellenistic period, something like one of the Gospels or the letter of the Romans would be a year's pay for a working person. So if you put that in our terminology, which is not exactly valid to do, you'd say that's somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000. If you're talking about tradesmen, but then our tradesmen are not as, not quite the same social class. So you're probably saying a scroll would be around, in our terms, around $50,000. This is a very expensive book. And you're not going to have private copies in circulation in people's homes. Now, that's different for just doing a 1-page letter home to mum from the front when you're a Roman soldier, okay? But if you're actually paying a scribe to produce a book roughly the size of the Gospel of Matthew or 1st Chronicles or something, it's a major... Doing one book would basically support that person and his family for the year. That would be his income. Yeah.
Greg, Ezra and Nehemiah, is it one scroll or 2 scrolls?
It's one scroll in Hebrew. And in the Septuagint it got broken up into 2 books. And of course in the Septuagint, the categories get arranged differently so that things like Ezra, Nehemiah and Chronicles go into the history section, historical books.
And the reason they're on one scroll is that dynamic you talked about, you buy the scroll at the market. And
Oh, it's also the same story. If you actually read Ezra, Nehemiah, I mean, Ezra is actually a big character in chapter 9 of Nehemiah. They're not like totally separate stories, yeah. They're overlapping stories with two different kind of characters in them. Yeah. But they're intertwined over the two books.
the scholars believe that it's the same author or authors.
Probably the same author, and indeed one of the issues is what's the relationship between the author of Ezra, Nehemiah and the author of Chronicles? Because they're all kind of coming out of the same think tank, as it were. Okay? In other words, the agenda, so to unpack that, because we won't be looking at Ezra, Nehemiah and stuff in detail, Ezra, Nehemiah and Chronicles are very focused on Jerusalem as the temple city and the centre of God's project. And that's why Nehemiah wants to rebuild the walls. That's why Ezra proclaims the law and gets rid of the foreign wives, who of course were Samaritan wives. Okay, but Jewish men from Jerusalem had been marrying Jewish women from Samaria because they were the same families, they were the same people. But Ezra comes in as a 4th century Taliban and says, that's not going to happen. Get rid of those foreigners. Well, the foreigners are worshippers of Yahweh. They're the descendants of Jacob, as they would say it. Okay, and they've even had apartments in the temple complex in Jerusalem. I mean, they're pretty well integrated into the Jerusalem social scene. Go to all the nightclubs and stuff. And Ezra says, get rid of your foreign wives. And that's a really strict process of disciplining a community and putting boundaries around who's in and who's out.
So essentially ethnic cleansing.
Well, it's not ethnic cleansing because the Samaritans were not in this. I mean, I'm not one to hesitate from accusing people of ethnic cleansing if I think it's appropriate. But in this case, it's ethnic separation. It's not even ethnic. It's actually, it's like saying the Anglicans on this side of the street and the Catholics on that side of the street. It's more like Northern Ireland. Okay, rather, because they're not trying to take over the other people's land and drive them out. They're simply saying, you go back to where you belong, and we are not having anything to do with you ever again. It's more like putting a wall between the West Bank and Israel. It's that kind of separation, which is slightly different from ethnic cleansing. Yeah. There's plenty of ethnic cleansing in the Old Testament, as you know from your Holy War essay. Okay, so Chronicles and Nehemiah, Ezra, in a sense, represent, if you like, the more temple-focused aspect of the let's rebuild our community project during the Persian period. And clearly what we pick up from Ezra and Nehemiah is that was not uncontested by the worshippers of Yahweh who just happened to live about 10 miles further north. I mean, we're not talking of several days' walk to get from Jerusalem to Nablus. Okay, Jerusalem to Shechem or Nablus. It's the slowest part is getting through the checkpoints, but you can get from Jerusalem to Nablus in probably 20 minutes by car or by bus. Okay, so it's sort of like going from here to Cleveland. Okay, it's not that far here to Ipswich. And of course, as we know, the Ipswich people are different from the Brisbane people. At least that's the story. Okay, so Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st, 2nd Chronicles breathes that project where let's really celebrate and establish and consolidate and expand Jerusalem's prestige as the city of Yahweh, the city of promise. And therefore Jerusalem can have no rivals. Therefore Shechem has to be eliminated. And in the case of Chronicles, Shechem is eliminated by writing them out of the story. Okay, as David will recall from his work on Chronicles, the people of the Northern Kingdom are basically missing from the story in Chronicles. It's all about David and Solomon in particular, and then you've sort of a quick wrap up of the other kings that followed in Jerusalem. What's the big deal about David and Solomon? David bought the real estate for the temple and hired all the staff, and Solomon built the temple. So the big idea in Chronicles is the temple. Okay, and Ezra and Nehemiah play into that by rebuilding the walls against the opposition of the Samaritans, who realise that if Jerusalem refortifies, they're not doing that because they don't sleep well at night. They're rebuilding the walls because they plan to get aggressive. Okay, why are we buying 58 Joint Strike Force fighters again? I mean, are we trying to upset the Indonesians? I mean, what are we doing here? We're going to attack New Zealand? Why are we buying these weapons? Or is it so we can go and play with the Americans when they invade somebody else and they want us to come along and help? And we've got the right tools. Okay? Similar, allow for the technological variation, similar issues then. What does it mean when a city fortifies itself? Okay? It's not just psychological. There's something going on. It's about power. And the people from Samaria protested to the Persian Empire about Jerusalem refortifying. And so the Ezra and Nehemiah find the documentation which says they're allowed to. Okay? And a part of the pushback, of course, then we're not having any more of your women living in our city. Get rid of the Samaritan women. Okay? So there's all these power dynamics going on as these books are generated. So in a sense, I've probably tapped into some of this, but one of the things to be thinking about there is that as we think about the relationship between Torah, Nevi'im and Kethubim, there are chronological implications, and we've sort of been playing with some of them already. There are as well considerations or implications to do with the shape of the canon, how we got the canon, and how the different parts of the canon interact with each other, and there are theological considerations or implications. In terms of chronology, I guess the most important thing is to recognize that the Torah comes first. Okay? The Torah is the foundational document. It could even be that some of the prophetic texts were written prior to the Torah, but the Torah is the set of writings which gain status first. Okay? So when and it's traditionally associated with Ezra, but when something like the event which is described in Nehemiah chapter 9, okay, which is Ezra gathering, and Nehemiah the governor, gathering all the people of the Jewish community, and they stand outside in the rain for a whole day, and they erect a dais, and Ezra goes up onto the dais and he reads the Torah. Okay, now that's actually the first reference in the Bible to the Torah being used. And it's like this is the official proclamation of the constitution of the kingdom not the kingdom, that would upset the Persians, of the temple of Jerusalem, the people of the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. Okay, Yehud, the people of Judah. And one of the fascinating little details, not only does he go to a dais and it's like he's reading from a lectern. Okay, this is the first official Bible reading in history. Okay. But they also have a team of translators doing simultaneous translation into Aramaic, because most of the Jews don't speak Hebrew. Okay, so there's a fascinating point. At the very time when perhaps the biblical documents are coming out into public and being officially presented and received, they're in a language that most people can't understand. So what's the point of the Bible if it's not intended to be read by the people in the community? Now this goes against the grain of 500 years of printing presses, mass literacy, and an expression of expressions of Christianity from the Reformation which are more biblical centered. Okay? But the time when the Old Testament is, if you like, emerging into the light of day and beginning to become a distinct and revered set of sacred texts, the text is being generated in Hebrew when most of the people speak Aramaic. Now for Anglicans in particular, that's a challenge, because one of our big ideas about 450 years ago was we put the prayer book and the Bible in the language of the vernacular of the common people. Well, the people who created the Bible did not have that agenda. They deliberately put the Bible, well, they weren't Anglicans, that's true. Okay? But, yeah. So they generated a sacred text which could only be read by the scribal elite. Now, push comes to shove, the official canonical copy of the Book of Common Prayer in 1662 is the Latin edition, not the English edition. And if there are any questions of interpretation, you go back to the Latin edition of the Book of Common Prayer. Because it was assumed at least as recently as 1978 and 1979, when I was ordained, the examining chaplains had to fib to the Archbishop that the candidates being presented for ordination were learned in the Latin tongue. There was not a single lesson in Latin in my time at St Francis College, and I missed out on doing Latin at high school. The school I went to stopped teaching Latin the year before I went there. You're good, but you'll be right, okay? So you might want to make the case to the Archbishop that I'm not validly ordained because I'm not learned in the Latin tongue. The examining chaplains fibbed. Mind you, I was not the only person in the room who was not learned in the Latin tongue. But you can see what's going on. We have the idea that the point of the Bible is to make God's word accessible to the ordinary person. No, it's not. Never has been. It's to control the ordinary person. It's to give a tool to the people in charge so they can control the ordinary person. It's a very different agenda. Now sure, the Reformation takes the Bible to a whole new place in terms of its prestige and its capacity to change things. And the Bible has enjoyed amazing influence precisely because it hasn't stayed within those initial constraints. It has become the document that shaped a people. So we become the people of the book. But for all the emphasis on reading the Bible, okay, it's when the Bible was first being generated, not only were there very few people who were literate, it wasn't even in the language that they could understand if it was read out loud to them. Okay, so in the story of Nehemiah, chapter 9, they have a panel of people doing simultaneous translation into Aramaic. Okay, because that's what people could understand. So it's fascinating. Again, this is part of the black box. We don't know exactly what's going on and why, but we can sort of put our ear up and listen to the clicks and the clunks and kind of get a sense of what's going on. And it's not exactly what we might expect. Okay. All right, so there are these fascinating canonical processes, but the primacy, in chronological terms, relates to Torah, the first 5. That's, if you like, whoever put that out, although they may not have realised at the time, they were creating the Bible. Okay, and they didn't have a publishing proposal to take to a publishing house. Okay, they just did it, like the person who invented the alphabet changed history. Or as Dr. Carl said on ABC Radio yesterday, the most important biomedical research breakthrough in human history is the idea that you keep your drinking water separate from your sewerage. If you get that right, a whole lot of other things change, and we don't need $20 billion taken off the poor people going to the doctors to work out what sort of biomedical research is needed. Okay? His point was that 5 out of the $7 surcharge is funding the biomedical $20 billion research fund, but it's coming from the people who can least afford to pay it. Okay, to fund it, and he's saying that as both a medical doctor and a medical researcher. So it wasn't the answer that Steve Austin was expecting. He said to Dr. Carl, "So what do you think? You must be happy about this $20 billion research fund." And he went chuk, 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 and dismantled him very nicely. Actually dismantled somebody else. Okay, so then so what's going on? We can sort of get a sense of what's going on canonically, or in terms of sort of time-wise and canonically. What's going on theologically? My suggestion, as you can hopefully see there, okay, is that they're coming to terms with being the self-conscious people of God, as they see it, in a world where their God is not in charge, or if their God is in charge, for some reason or other, he lets other people and their gods act like they're in charge. So in other words, there's a problem of, so God's supreme, God's done all this for us, God's brought our ancestors out of Egypt, God's given us the covenant, and the Persians get to run the world. Go figure. Okay? And after the Persians, the Greeks get a turn. And after the Greeks, the Romans get a turn. When do the people of God get a turn? Okay? So there's a deep theological dilemma for people of faith. And I think the Kethubim is where that dynamic becomes the main game. The big theological issue on the front of the page. Okay? For the Torah and for the prophets, they're really addressing people of power within the Jerusalem hierarchy who have the capacity to change things. Okay? And there's still a king, or they're hoping there's going to be a king in the case of the Torah. The time we get to the Kethubim, there is no king. There's an emperor. And the emperor lives a long way away, but he has a very big army, and he doesn't speak Jewish. And he doesn't do Yahweh. Okay? So again, it comes back to assimilation and resistance. Okay? So do we just assimilate, or convert to Babylonian, or convert to Persian, or convert to Hellenistic? Or do we say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to be faithful to the traditions of the fathers. And I think that's the big theological dilemma that's at the heart of the Kethubim. Okay, so the Kethubim explore ideas such as, and they don't use this exact language because the kingdom of God never occurs as a phrase in the Old Testament. What does it mean to be the kingdom of God when the community no longer has a king or an army or a separate territorial kind of existence? What does it mean to live as a faithful minority within an empire that has opposing values, entirely different values? And how can we integrate the expanding common knowledge which was becoming known to the elite in ancient Jerusalem through the Persian and Hellenistic periods? How do we take on board everything we're now learning about the world with traditional spiritual values? Now, as I note there, they're a bit like contemporary questions for Christians in the 21st century. Because we had our go at running Christian empires and medieval Europe and Christendom and all that sort of stuff. Yeah? But now we're in a very different space. So, after a much longer introduction than I thought we'd have, let's move into the sacred songs. So we're going to play particularly with, just raise some big top level issues about the Psalms and the 5 festival scrolls. So as I mentioned, the Psalms come first in the Kethubim. If you're looking at the traditional Jewish arrangement of the Tanakh, when you get to the Kethubim, the Psalter, the Psalms is the first one. It comes first, and of course it gathers up religious texts and that are used in worship. Now, are they used in temple worship? Are they used in private worship? Okay, are they personal texts? Are they public texts? That's one of the interesting issues. At some kind of level, the people that give us the final version of the Psalter want us to think of the Psalter as somehow reflecting the Torah, because it's broken up into 5 collections. Okay, 1 to 41, 42 to 72, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, and then 107 to 150. One of the interesting footnotes there is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, they have the Psalter as far as the end of Book 3. And then they continue with more Psalms, but they're not the same as the canonical Psalms. So at least for the grumpy old priests that stormed out of the temple in Jerusalem and went and camped in an abandoned army base on the side of the Dead Sea, their version of the Psalter was different from the version that we know. Okay? And of course in the Septuagint there's 151 psalms, not 150. Yep.
Greg, would that lead us to think that they wrote their own psalms at Qumran?
Oh, they did, but there's a different scroll for them. Well, there's both. I mean, it actually opens up this question. So, what's the relationship between the community using the psalms and an individual writing and using the psalms? Okay. So, in the case of Qumran, one of the interesting things is a thing called the Thanksgiving Scroll, which is really a whole lot of psalms, hymns of thanksgiving. But the other psalms that make up the rest of the Qumran Psalter, some of them are the same as ours, but they're not in the same order, and some of them are psalms which don't exist in our collection of the psalms. Now, it doesn't mean they were written by the people of Qumran, just that their Psalter, their traditional book of prayers, was 2/3 of it was the same, and the last third was a bit different. Yeah.
The last third differed. Is there any like themes, where you think that there was a different context, a different theology? Is there something?
Okay. Are there? Well, so the question is, to what extent can we see? Is there a difference between the kind of issues, themes, focal, whatever, in first three books, which we share, and then the last two books of Qumran go a bit different? I don't think there are, but this is not an area that I've done particular study on. Okay, it's not my sort of area of looking at it in more detail. So I'm not familiar with the psalms that are only found at Qumran. Are they different in terms of content and so on? My expectation is they wouldn't be so much different, that just they are alternative texts that are not the same as our texts. But yeah, and the other thing about the Psalms of Qumran is that there are multiple copies of the texts of the Psalms of Qumran, and I think from memory, I mean, the most common texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical texts, are the Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. I think we looked at this last time, and I can't remember the numbers, but something like 38 comes to mind. But I think there are more copies of the Book of Psalms at Qumran than there are of any other part of the Old Testament. So they clearly were into Psalms, and that's interesting because we think they were a priestly community who saw themselves as continuing the temple rituals in exile, self-imposed exile. So that would speak to the social location of the Psalms within the life of the temple. And even a breakaway group of priests who storm out of the temple, we're not coming to your services anymore, they still keep using the same prayer book. They still keep using the Psalms and writing their own, writing more of the same. So it points to that intersection of public liturgical life. One of the there are a couple of big historical questions about the Psalms, and one of them is the question about the relationship. How much of this content comes even from the first temple? How much of the Book of Psalms might have been written back in the time of Josiah or whoever from the first temple period? Okay, and it's assumed that most of them, if we think about it for obvious reasons, most of them come out of the life of the temple in the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period is the temple rebuilt during the Persian period down to the Roman period. Well, of course, these are the texts coming out of that historical period. But it could well be that some of the texts which we used in the Jerusalem temple in the Persian and Hellenistic period were actually texts which had been created some centuries earlier. And the other kind of historical, form critical kind of issue that gets in there is, of course, a number of the Psalms are attributed to David, and David becomes the kind of the patron figure for psalm writing, and Solomon becomes the patron figure for wisdom literature. So David with his harp is like the temple musician, and Solomon with his wisdom is the court wise man. Okay. So what does it mean for a psalm to have a superscription saying for David or to David or of David or relating to David? It's just le David. And the question is, what does le mean in that context? Okay. So traditionally it's been understood as this is one David wrote. Okay. but it could also mean dedicated to David or of the style of David, or we don't know for sure. And the other twist there relates to the superscriptions, which it's an interesting point about what counts as Bible. Most modern Bibles start the verse numbering after the superscription. And if you look in your normal NRSV, NIV, whatever, the superscription will be in italics before verse 1 and after the chapter number. And the implication is this is not actually part of the Bible. Okay, the psalm starts at verse 1. Okay, so what's the status of the superscription? Particularly when the superscriptions at Qumran don't correlate with the superscriptions in the Masoretic text, which also don't correlate exactly with the superscriptions in the Greek version. So even when the psalm is the same, the superscription varies sometimes between the Greek version, the later Masoretic version, and the version of Qumran. Okay, so the exact significance of the superscription is interesting, and I think it goes to the question of reception. Okay, what the superscriptions are doing is they're giving us an insight into how an ancient reader was receiving the psalm and connecting it with another part of the Bible. Like this is a psalm David wrote, like the case of Psalm 51, after he'd sinned with Bathsheba. So the person reading that psalm is connecting it with the story of David and Bathsheba. There's nothing in the psalm itself that refers to David and Bathsheba. The person reading the psalm is doing an intertextual kind of hookup, and they're saying, I'm in effect, wow, this psalm fits with, I guess this is what David was thinking when he came to his senses after his relationship with Bathsheba. So it's that kind of a intertextual dynamic going on. But in the life of the church, generally speaking, and certainly in the prayer book, we have just deleted the superscriptions. When we talk about the Psalter, there are no superscriptions. Okay? So are they part of the Bible or not part of the Bible? Because when it gets to the other biblical books, we delete them entirely and pay no attention to them. Okay, Romans, Galatians, Matthew, Mark, they all have superscriptions indicating, in the opinion of the scribes, who wrote the book, where they were at the time, and when they wrote it. And we ignore all that. We just delete it and say, that's not part of Mark's Gospel. That's not part of Romans. That's not part of 1 Corinthians. But when it comes to the Psalms, in some ways of using the Psalms, it's like reading it in a Bible, we encounter the superscription. When the Psalms are used liturgically, we don't pay attention. We don't even print the superscription. And we don't give them verse numbers, which means we're sort of leaving them out of the text. And yet we print them in the printed Bibles. So what's going on? Okay. So we get this kind of a sort of reflection in the kind. It's certainly not a hard stroke. It's not like they've forced a new page break, put a big subtitle. Here begins book 1, book 2, whatever. It's more that there are 4 points in the course of the Psalter where it says this is the end of the Psalms of David the son of Jesse, or this is the end of the Psalms collected by so and so. So there are kind of 5 collections, and we're not exactly sure what to make of that internal patterning. One of the reasons is that the so-called Elohistic Psalter, which is what I'm referring to here, these are the psalms that instead of talking about Yahweh, talk about Elohim. And in 1 or 2 cases, they're exactly the same psalm, they've changed the word for God and used the text again. Okay? So, and it goes from 42 to 83. So there's a chunk of psalms which have a different word for God, and they don't correlate with one of the 5 books. Okay, so that there are real complexities in the literary form of the manuscript for the Hebrew. Looking at the set as a whole, the first 2 psalms are seen as wisdom psalms. But interestingly, where does wisdom come from? It comes from reading the Torah. Okay? So by now, the people doing the Psalms are recognizing that the heart of Jewish religion is Torah, not going to the temple. Whereas in the earlier period, the heart of Jewish religion was offering a sacrifice at the appropriate place and time. Now it's becoming studying Torah. Indeed, by putting these two psalms at the beginning of the book of the Psalter, I think the redactor is saying, when you read these psalms, you are reading Torah. Okay? You're not just browsing the hymn book. Okay? You're actually engaging in Torah. That's an interesting rebadging of psalm reading, that it actually becomes a meditation on Torah. Okay? Psalms 3 to 41 are identified as Psalms of David. Then there's half a dozen or so that are called the Psalms of Korah. Then there's another 21 Psalms that are linked as Psalms of David. Another 10 Psalms that are the Psalms of an otherwise unknown character called Asaph. Okay. Then there's a short set of Psalms which are attributed to various guilds of singers. There's a set of Psalms that have a lot of content that's similar, including a lot of historical summary of the story of the Old Testament. Then there's another couple of Psalms of David, a series of Alleluia Psalms. You get Psalm 119, which is that great acrostic psalm, 176 verses long, broken into 22 sections, each section beginning with a word that starts with the appropriate letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And again, it's an intentional and very highly sophisticated literary reflection on the significance of Torah. Okay? And presumably at one point it was the end of the Psalter, and it was kind of a bracket, the bookend, with Psalm 1 and 2, Psalm 119. But then more psalms came along, and so the collection kept growing. Again, we can only guess at those kind of literary dynamics. We don't have examples of the text at different points in history. Then we have psalms to be used when you're going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We have some more Hallelujah psalms, and we have some more David psalms, and then we wrap it up with a few more Hallelujah psalms. And of course the word Hallelujah means sing to Yahweh. Yahu there is Yahweh, and Hallel is song. Okay, so Hallelujah means sing to Yahweh. Okay, now there's a lot of the critical work on the Psalms, and you'll see this in Kugler and other places, a lot of the critical issues around the Psalms for the last 100 years or so has been identifying genre, like Psalms of Lament, Psalms of Thanksgiving, and so on, playing with the interface of corporate or community and personal, individual, and then trying to work out a situation in life, a sitzum Leben, but a situation in life where that kind of psalm would be used. Okay? And so a lot of the 20th century was devoted to looking at the psalms in that way. More recently, people have tried to see, so what makes these texts hang together? Never mind, okay, that's a song for the enthronement of a new king. Okay, that's nice, that's where it comes from, but why is it here? What's it contributing to the set? Okay, there's some really interesting work being done looking at thematic issues even through the 5 books, so-called 5 books, that you can see thematic differences as you go through the 5 books. So if you're interested in the Psalms, which of course their primary function in the church is as liturgical texts to this day, okay, and for personal private devotion as well as public liturgy. But scholars, psalm specialists, are saying, well, actually, these are also canonical texts. They're not just things to use in church, okay, for singing and so on, not just for private devotions. These are biblical texts. Is it just coincidence that Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, comes after Psalm 22 and before Psalm 24? Is that just random? Or is there actually some theological coherence, some intentionality in the canonical order? Okay? And at what point are we seeing faces in the clouds? At what point are we noticing stuff that's actually there? Because we can try too hard sometimes. All right, just quickly wrapping up, because it's almost time for the first break, and that's to look at the Megilloth. And one of the interesting things about the Megilloth, apart from, is their own canonical reception history. In the Septuagint, they get divided up and put by literary type. Okay, so more historical books go into the historical collection, more lyrical, poetic books go into the poetry section of the Septuagint of the Greek Bible. But in the Jewish tradition, the Megilloth continued to be a little set of 5 scrolls, and in different ancient versions of the Jewish Bible, it occurs in different places. So it's almost like it's outside the Torah, Nevi'im, Kethubim. Okay, and it doesn't really settle into its place after sort of in the middle part of the Kethubim until quite late in medieval European history in terms of manuscript evidence. Okay, so it was kind of this little set of 5 texts was a floater. Whose canonical, everybody knew about them and used them, but bearing in mind they were not normally publishing Bibles as a codex. But when they did, they had to decide, well, where are we going to put the Megilloth? Do we put them in with the Kethubim? Do we put them in with the prophets? Do we put them in after the Torah? What are we going to do with these books? Where do they fit in? So certainly what is now the canonical location or the traditional location of the Megilloth is coming after Psalms, Job and Proverbs. That's a late medieval development. So there was at least flux as late as that. Okay. Now, as we've been going through the process, we've dealt with some of these things, like we've dealt with the manuscript variations from Qumran. We've dealt with the social historical context in terms of Persian and Hellenistic political and cultural kind of tsunami hitting the Jewish community, and issues of assimilation and resistance, which we'll continue seeing go through here. But one of the related issues there is who's writing this stuff and who's using this stuff. Okay? Who are the readers? Who are the creators of this material? And the short answer has to be that it's more likely going to be people from the elite circles in Jerusalem than it's going to be fishermen or farmers from the Galilee or from the hill country around Jerusalem. Okay? In terms of literacy levels, in terms of leisure from subsistence farming and generating a surplus for the king, it's going to be the scribal class, the literate class, the latte class, as we call it these days, but the people who have the connections and the social opportunity to acquire an education and a social role where this kind of knowledge is useful. Okay, and that's going to, of course, include the priests. It's going to include the scribal classes. It's going to include merchants who have to have a certain amount of numeracy and literacy. Okay, so the concern to have job-ready graduates is not just a 21st century issue. You wanted people who could actually go on ships and keep tabs of the costs and bring back things at a good price and all the rest. Okay, and of course rulers engage these people as retainers because they're the ones who actually allow the ruler to rule. They implement the government, they implement the administration. And certainly both the Persian and the Hellenistic kingdoms and empires, they worked on a basis of devolved authority, devolved structure. So they didn't send out Persian officials to manage every part of the empire. They co-opted local officials and traditional leadership groups to continue organising their people and reporting back in to the centre. So it's and those kind of circles are going to be the circles where you're going to be training a cadre of new scribes to continue the work of the kingdom. And that's going to be not only the location for this kind of literature, which is more liturgical and temple probably in focus, it's also going to be very important for the wisdom literature and also for apocalyptic. Okay? It's the people who have an education and some opportunity for engagement with people from elsewhere. And then they're not going to get frequent flyer points, but they're going to be people that are more connected socially with the world outside Jerusalem. We're not talking about the village people, we're not talking about the farmers, we're not talking about the fishermen. We're talking about educated people in the city. One of the interesting questions, I think, around the role of the Megilloth, and it comes particularly to the questions of Song of Songs and Esther. As you may recall, most of the books of the Jewish scriptures are known from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, with two exceptions, Song of Songs and Esther. Okay, they don't occur at Qumran. Now, is that just coincidence? Or is it interesting, is it significant that it coincides with the fact that we know that even well into the 1st century, the Common Era, there were debates around the special status, the canonical status of those two books. Song of Songs was too raunchy, and it was very popular for singing in the taverns after a few jugs of beer. And the rabbis felt that was not very good. Okay? Now, to his credit, Rabbi Akabar says, he doesn't like the Song of Songs being sung in the taverns because as the Holy of Holies is to the temple, so the Song of Songs is to the Tanakh, to the scriptures. But it's actually the most holy of the scriptures. But clearly behind that comment, there's a uncertainty about what to do about this text, which we, of course, rarely read in church for same reasons, and that happens to fit in or to match its absence from Qumran. So it wasn't a text they were encouraging people to use at Qumran. The other one, of course, is Esther, which is particularly significant from the set of the Megilloth, in that Esther is the liturgical text for the Feast of Purim. And indeed, Purim is the celebration of the events which are talked about in the book of Esther. But Esther never uses the word Yahweh. So there was a debate as to whether it was really a text that, quote, defiled the hands. The phrase was, defiled the hands. Is this a text that defiles the hands? So in terms of, like the question from Voldemort before about at what point do these books become sacred or become divine and so on. The way that ancient Jewish people talked about that was not with that abstract phrase, but with a more objective thing. Is this a book that you have to wash your hands before and after you touch it? Is this a sacred object? Or is it just an ordinary book? Now, if a book has Yahweh in it, you've got to wash your hands. It defiles the hands. It's a holy object. Don't touch it. It's like the Ark of the Covenant. Touch it, gone, dead. Okay, so they had a sense of sacred taboo, and the problem with Esther is that it didn't qualify under normal provisions for that kind of status, but it was essential for the Feast of Purim. So guess what? Esther makes it into the Bible. Okay, because we need that story. What's more interesting is they didn't edit the book of Esther to drop in a couple of Yahwehs here and there. That would have been relatively easy to do. Okay? Just a slight scribal emendation in verse 1 or whatever, you could have easily slipped in a Yahweh or two. So it also suggests that that kind of categorization was not active at the time when the text of Esther was being finalized, and then there was sufficient respect for the received form of the text that they were not going to consciously edit it to make it comply with a later set of categories. And that speaks to the if you like, the quality control, the version control issues around these texts, which are increasingly becoming important. On the other hand, they had no, and that's actually, it's even odder, because the Book of Esther has numerous additions in the Greek version. And it would be interesting actually to go and see whether those additions introduce Kyrios as a substitute for Yahweh. The other book which they had no hesitation in editing was the Book of Daniel, which kept acquiring new chapters. There's 2 or 3 extra chapters in the Greek version of Daniel. Okay? So that would also suggest that Daniel comes later in the process, and as in the finalization of Daniel is not as determined and fixed at an earlier date, whereas the Book of Esther, while there are some additions in the Septuagint, they certainly did not edit the Hebrew text to make it comply with what would just guarantee it a place in the canon. So the canonical processes are less formal and not as intentional as perhaps we would like to think of them being. And it's not like the high priest convened a high-powered committee of theological experts and said, guys, we've really got to pull all this stuff together. We need an authoritative collection of sacred texts, and there are all this other stuff out there that's just theological junk. So we need you guys to come up with a ruling, which books are in, which books are out. It has been very much a process of reception, in which various factors have played their part, and certainly in the late Hellenistic period, 2nd century BCE, 1st century BCE, in the post-Maccabean kind of period, one of the dynamics was that you could buy a copy of this book from the temple. Okay, and the temple was only going to only going to produce texts which were kosher in terms of their content. So one of the elements of quality control, and indeed a kind of de facto canonization process, would be which of the books that are in the temple collection and are used from time to time in the temple liturgies. And the answer would be something that looks very much like the Tanakh. The Pentateuch, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Kethubim. Okay? And so in a sense, while there will be more debates, around the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, in a sense, the practical canonization principle that was working in the 2nd century BCE would be, does the high priest have a copy of this that's used in the temple? Or in our terms, is this one of the books they use at the cathedral? If it's a cathedral book, it's in. Temple book, it's in. If it's not a cathedral/temple book, then it's a bit more up for grabs as to its status.